All right, welcome everyone to the launch of our Wildfire peer exchange. This is intended to allow local governments and governing bodies, which we'll cover, who are implementing the new 2025 Colorado Wildfire Resilience Code, which just passed in July, on July 1st. And now local governing bodies have 9 months until April 1st of 2026 to meet or exceed this minimum code. My name is Marguerite Harden, and I'm with the Colorado Resiliency Office, and I'm here today with partners at the Department of DPS, Department of Public Safety, Division of Fire Prevention and Control, DFPC, Carrie Larson, and she is going to be presenting today. Just as a little bit of background on what a peer exchange is, we at the Colorado Resiliency Office have hosted a number of peer exchanges through different disruptions and recovery from disruptions, including wildfire recovery from the 2020 wildfires, including from COVID. And it's just a really great way we have found for local governments across the state to be coordinated and being able to share some of their resources with each other. Our role here with the CRO and with DFPC is really to act as facilitators. So this is really an informal forum. It's really meant to provide you all that opportunity to engage with each other. And it is not an opportunity to provide or receive regulatory feedback on your local codes. So just want to emphasize that we are really a facilitator only, and this is your time. We want to highlight some of the local best practices or local questions that we are hearing, but we also don't want this to become an opportunity for anything regulatory. So it's great to see a number of familiar names and faces actually who I know from previous peer exchanges. So good to see you. And I'm just going to drop into the chat our peer exchange agenda and notes that are available for you all to follow along. We already have linked the PowerPoint from today in this agenda. And you can also see what our next upcoming meeting is going to be on. So again, this is just an introduction to the peer exchange. We really want all the participants of this peer exchange to come in with a common baseline knowledge about what this wildfire resilience code is, since it is a first of its kind minimum code for the state. And so this will be recorded and posted on our website. And then in future peer exchanges, so on August 6th, which will be our first monthly peer exchange, we're currently scheduled to be the first Wednesday of every month. We will be actually having more of an open forum. But for today and for now, I'm going to just pass it over to Carrie Larson to kick us off and introduce the code and herself. And I will just note that we should have some time at the end of this call where we will stop recording and we will have a bit of time, maybe 10 minutes for an open discussion. So stick around for that. So Carrie, over to you.
Thank you so much, Marguerite. A really big thanks to the Colorado Resiliency Office for getting this stood up with us over at the Division of Fire Prevention and Control. This is a really great opportunity to get everyone at the same table so that you guys have the opportunity to discuss, as Marguerite said, best practices, what you're learning, what your challenges are for the implementation of this code. A lot of familiar faces and a lot of familiar names, so thanks for joining. We are going to walk through just a background to the code board and the code, what that looks like and what it means for you as local jurisdictions or adopting governing bodies. And then I'll get into a bit about mapping towards the end. We'll do a little demo of the state map and talk through what your options are for the locally developed mapping. I am going to start sharing my screen here in just a minute, but right before I do that, I want to drop into the chat a link to the code board website and then just an email address for you to reach out to for the code board. And then separately, an email address for if you have questions, and we'll get into this a little bit later, about how to request support from the Division of Fire Prevention and Control for that inspections and enforcement capacity, and what that's going to look like, what kind of regulations they might put in place. So again, this first email address is if you would like to reach out to the code board. And the second one for Chris Brunette, he is the chief of our fire and life safety section, and he can answer all of your questions about inspections and enforcement support from the division. I am going to go ahead and get started on sharing the screen. Just making sure you guys can all see this. Great. All right. So again, just a quick background to the board. And for those of you who have joined us before, you've heard a lot of this. But from 2000, for the past 25 years or so, we have seen a pretty increased frequency and intensity of the wildfires in Colorado. Most of the most damaging wildfires that we have seen, and the ones that have caused the most chaos and loss in the state, have been since 2000. So in the last 25 years. One of those being East Troublesome Fire in October 2020. That was a pretty big fire year for us, unfortunately. We've also seen a growing population in Colorado, and that growing population has led to an expansion of our wildland urban interface areas and just encroachment of those wildland urban interface areas. And so in reaction to the growing population, that growing WUI area, and the continual sight that we've experienced with these wildfires and us facing wildfires in the last 25 years, Governor Polis reached out to our Colorado Fire Commission, that is an advisory board within the Division of Fire Prevention and Control, and asked that they look into this growing issue and find ways to best address it for the state. They took that on. They moved into a lot of subcommittee meetings that were dedicated with subject matter experts, and ultimately decided this is a big issue, and it's going to take a lot of subject matter expertise that are focused solely on that. So they recommended the establishment of the board. That came through in Senate Bill 23-166 back in 2023. It established the board itself, our mission, our responsibilities and duties, and that bill also saw an update for certain sections this year after this legislative session with Senate Bill 25-142. That bill updated the timelines and for the local jurisdictions to adopt. That's the primary change that 142 enacted. And then it just clarified some other things. So Senate Bill 23-166 is a great starting point if you have questions about our responsibilities and duties, and 142 if you have questions about what might have changed with the timelines and with cooperative agreements. So that was established in 2023. That got the board stood up. We had our first meetings in October of that year. And from then on, we started to have many, many meetings that really dove into the research behind this and how we can develop a code that will move the needle in terms of building this resiliency for the state of Colorado to wildfires, while also acknowledging that our local jurisdictions have their on-the-ground knowledge that we want to tap into. And then you guys can create your own codes that meet these standards that are the best way for your communities to respond. So our code board is made up of 24 individuals, 3 ex officios who represent differing state agencies. That's the Colorado Resiliency Office, who's helping us support this project today. The Colorado State Forest Service, I know a lot of them are on today as well. They've been really helpful in developing our map, which again, we'll get into more in just a little bit. And then the Division of Fire Prevention and Control, which ultimately hosts this board. The other 21 members are all appointed by governing, or I'm sorry, legislative leaders and the executive director of the Department of Public Safety. They represent all different regions across the state of Colorado. They represent rural and urban areas, metropolitan areas, regional sections, and they also represent subject matter experts in fire service, fire behavior, insurance, utilities, and building or development, among many others. So you can see them all here. You can also find a link to who is currently serving on the board on our website and figure out who is in charge of sending up the next appointments for filling our seats. Now to get into the code itself. The administration of this code, who adopts it? That comes down to governing bodies. And again, this is outlined in Senate Bill 166. So if you have questions, I would refer you over there. Governing bodies, adopting governing bodies are those that have jurisdictions within wildland-urban interface areas that have the ability to adopt building codes or fire codes. There are 4 listed right here: city councils, town councils, boards of trustees, boards of directors for fire protection districts, governing bodies of improvement districts that have fire service, and boards of county commissioners. If you have questions about if you need to adopt that code, talk to your local legal counsel, look at that Senate Bill 166. That will really help clarify what you need to do. So that's adopting the code. The enforcement of this code isn't dictated by the board itself. That is up to the rules and regulations that you have set out when you adopt the code. Now, there are a couple of stipulations, and one is that if you do not have rules and regulations in place for enforcing the code, you can request support for inspections and enforcement from the Division of Fire Prevention and Control. Again, if you would like to do that, or if you have questions about what to do and how to go through that process, reach out to Chief Brunette. That's the email address that I dropped in the chat earlier. He can answer a lot of those questions about how the division will set those processes and what you need to do in order to request that support. So that is the adoption and enforcement. Now, as Marguerite mentioned earlier, the state and the board adopted this code on July 1st, this year, 2025. That was adopted through the rules, and those rules I will link in the chat as well, but you can find them on the website. Local governing bodies now have until April 1st, 2026 at the latest to adopt a local code. So 9 months to adopt, and then from April 1st, you have at maximum 3 months to implement that adopted code. So that puts us no later than July 1st, 2026 to have these codes adopted and implemented. Now, if your local rules and regulations identify that the code must be implemented prior to that July 1st deadline of next year, then you need to follow those local rules and regulations. So again, July 1st this year, we adopted. You have until April 1st, 2026 to adopt a local code, and 3 months, up to 3 months after that, so July 1st of 2026, to implement your locally adopted code. Now, looking at the code scope. So this gets really into the code itself, and you can find all of this. I've linked the chapters that are associated with what we're talking about in that top right corner for you. So this is in chapter 1. What does the code apply to? Just as a reminder, this is not a retrofit code. This is a code that applies to permitting and inspections. It's primarily for new development, so new structures and new defensible space around those structures. This is for both residential and commercial, so take that into consideration as well. Now, the only times this applies to existing structures is when there are significant alterations, repairs, replacements, or any additions to the existing structure, and only in specific circumstances. So if you are adding an addition and that addition increases the square footage of the existing structure by 500 square feet or more, then this code needs to apply. If you are doing an alteration, a repair, a replacement, and it affects 25% or more of the exterior of the structure, this code needs to apply. So that means that it does not apply to interior alterations of existing structures. It doesn't apply to existing structures that have to come into compliance with no changes or modifications made. And it doesn't apply to routine maintenance work. Now, there's another addition to that, which is if the structure is on 35 acres or more, that only has one residential structure and it doesn't abut other residential commercial areas, that is also excluded from this code. And that's written in the statute as well. So again, I'll refer you over to Senate Bill 166. So again, primarily this is new construction and development and significant alterations, additions, repairs, remodels. It's not a retrofit code. It does not apply to routine maintenance work. So keep that in mind as we move forward. Now, we'll go into the code applicability. This you can find primarily outlined in Chapter 3 of our code. This is a state minimum code. So we're setting the minimum standards that your local code needs to meet or exceed. Now, there are going to be two levels of requirements. There are Class 1 requirements and Class 2 requirements. Class 1 will apply to all areas identified with the low fire intensity classification. And those will be identified on our state map in yellow. We'll get into that map in just a little bit. Class 2 requirements go just a little bit further because they are applying to areas that have more fire hazard. They have moderate or high fire intensity classifications. Those areas will be identified in orange and red in our state map for application. So between Class 1 and then Class 2, we also have the ability for local code officials to make determinations based on ground truthing. So these can be the individual parcels that the code official is making that determination on. You can look at the rules and regulations that we adopted on July 1st and look into the body of the code in Chapter 3 for how that ground truthing needs to proceed. So there are a couple of different options for you here. There's Class 1 for low, Class 2 for moderate and high, and then the ground truthing, which really comes down to determination by the local code official. And again, we're going to get into the mapping in just a little bit. I'm going to just do a quick review of the code requirements. Structure hardening is the first set. Structure hardening can be found in Chapter 4 of our Colorado Wildfire Resiliency Code. Class 1, again for low hazard and low fire intensity areas, have requirements for Class A roofing, has requirements for gutters and downspouts and vents. Class 2, when we move into those higher fire intensity classifications for moderate and high, they have all of the requirements for Class 1, and then we start adding on. So we'll add on the requirements for exterior walls, and there are 5 different ways that you can meet that requirement for exterior walls and sidings. There are requirements for eaves, for underfloor enclosures, appendages and projections. There's requirements for decking and exterior windows and doors, and then any detached accessory structure. So these are standalone accessory structures to the primary structure. So those are the structure hardening requirements for Class 1 and Class 2. You can find those all in Chapter 4 in much more depth. Then we move into Chapter 5, and this chapter goes over our site management requirements. Again, we'll start with Class 1, and then for Class 2, we build on those requirements. So Class 1 has requirements for signage and addressing. These are pretty general requirements that we've set out. If your local jurisdiction has already in place requirements for signage and addressing, just make sure that they're at least meeting what we've put out. This is a lot for situational awareness for our emergency responders and making sure that the communities have awareness of where they are at all times. So signage and addressing requirements, pretty general. Retaining walls within a certain distance of that structure or when they provide specific support to the structure itself. Some requirements for fencing. This is within 8 feet of the structure. And then structure ignition zone 1. This is 0 to 5 feet of from the structure. This is a requirement for vegetation mitigation and hardening of that structure. This aligns very closely with the requirements or the guidelines that are set out by Colorado State Forest Service in their home ignition zone guide. Because this code applies to both homes and residences as well as commercial, we have renamed it for this code as structure ignition zone. So it's any of those structures that this applies to is 0 to 5 feet for that vegetation and fuel mitigation. Class 2, again, when we move into those higher fire intensity classifications where that fire hazard is more prominent, we are looking at structure ignition zone 2, which extends from 5 feet to 30 feet. And there are less requirements in that area than in structure ignition zone 1. But there are requirements for limbing, removing of dead materials. We're looking at the types of clumping for vegetation. And then we extend that a little bit further from 30 feet to 100 feet. And if you have that spacing on the parcel, then there's some additional requirements for 30 to 100 feet. But again, they're less than what we see in zone 2, which is less than what we see in zone 1. All of those structure ignition zones, they are up to the property line or to this distance, whichever one comes first. So if you have a property line that ends at 25 feet, we are not asking that you are implementing requirements from parcel to parcel. This is parcel specific. So just take a look at chapter 5 and you can see all of the requirements there. Now, as promised, we are going to get into a little bit more of the mapping in itself. Mapping that we have developed by the board for this code is specific for code application. Now, governing bodies can choose to either adopt this state map that we have developed by the board or develop their own local map. The state map that we've developed identifies fire hazard and fire intensity classifications throughout the entire state. So we're looking statewide at this. It's informed by data modeling that identified slope. It identified around 50 fuel types that are specific to Colorado and about 40 years of critical fire weather data. That information we built with the Colorado State Forest Service, and then through some techniques with some smoothing, filtering, and different aggregation techniques with GIS background, we adjusted the raw data and added it into this map because this is specific for code application. Now, the map also goes through and identifies features in a hexagonal shape, and we'll get into that in just a minute. Beyond the state map, if a local jurisdiction wants to adopt a local map, they can do that. There are requirements that are laid out in our rules and our code that you can look into, but ultimately that locally developed map just needs to illustrate the conditions on the ground that meet or exceed the intent of the code and our state map. So we're going to start with the state map. Oops, I'm so sorry here. We're going to start with the state map and then we'll get into a little demo. I'm just making sure we're on the right page here. All right. So the state map, this again, the intent of this is really for code application. There's no intent beyond that. So This is here to give you an illustration of which classification needs to apply to which parcels when you're looking at the grand view of the state. This can be used by any adopting governing body if they choose not to develop or utilize their own locally developed map. And again, for the application of the code. Now, as I was mentioning, this gets into a hexagonal shape. That hexagonal shape is really, it's a GIS method that's useful for grouping data. And it really helps identify that community level hazard and adjacent conditions that will inform the hazard for individual parcels. So we're looking at 25-acre hexagons, and that is what we'll be seeing when we dive into this map. I want to make sure you're going to follow along here. Great. So this is what the map currently looks like when you go into the site. So I'm going to zoom in on Boulder. This is the area that we've typically looked at when we've done some of these demos. So just to keep it consistent, that's where we will be looking today. As you can see, if we zoom in, you get these hexagons. That's what we were talking about, that are 25 acres, and really take into consideration the surrounding areas of that center of the hexagon. And they look at the fire hazard and all of those inputs of the data that we were considering: the slope, the fire weather, the vegetation. So you'll see that some of these areas are low and they'll abut right next to moderate. Some are low and abut right up next to an area that isn't identified on this map. So on these maps, you have the yellow, which is the low fire intensity classification, and then you'll see areas of orange and areas of red. Those areas have class 2. So those are moderate and high fire intensity classification, and that's where you will need to enforce and apply the class 2 requirements of the code. Class 1 are in those yellow areas. There are areas where you can search by an address or a place. So we can search, we'll go to the city of Grand Junction. As you type that in, it will take you directly over to that area. And then you can start to zoom in or out based on your need. You can also search by parcel number. So if you have development that doesn't have an address yet, and you're not entirely sure where within the jurisdiction boundaries it lies, but you have the exact parcel number, you can search for it right there. Now, we have a couple of buttons up at the top. You have the map layers. This is the Wildfire Resiliency Code Fire Intensity Classification layer. That's the main one that you will see. And then we've got a couple of base layers that you can look at right now. As we finalize this and we get people moving forward with their own locally developed map, if that's what they choose, some of these layers may disappear and we'll be left with primarily the wildfire resiliency intensity classification layer. So keep in mind, this may be the only one that's available as we move forward over the next couple of months. All of the fire intensity, fire intensity scale layer and the surface fuel layers, you can find those on the Colorado State Forest Service website through their mapping tools. So if you're looking for more specific data that is not for the code application, check with their website. You can also go into the legend. The legend will give you the Colorado boundaries. It will tell you what areas are identified, what the colors mean. You can see that these hatched areas that are colored, those are federal or tribal lands where this code does not currently apply and will not apply. So solid color, that's where the code applies. This hatched area, federal or tribal lands where the code doesn't apply, but it should help inform code official decisions when they make those determinations. All right. If you're looking for more information about the map itself, you can open that About tab and you'll get this on the side that goes through kind of the background of how we developed that map and where the information comes from. Again, any other questions you have about the map, go ahead and send them to that first email address that I dropped in the chat for the code board. So that is the state map. And again, local jurisdictions can choose to use this. They can also choose to develop their own local map. Now, the local map requirements are outlined both in the rules that are adopted on July 1st of this year. There's a link right here to them. You can also find them on the code board website. Certain requirements are also outlined in the code. But primarily, the locally developed map will be used for the application of the local code that's adopted and will be used only by the governing body that has adopted that map. So no other governing body will be using that map, will only be used for the adopting governing body. Now, any cooperative agreements or MOUs that you may have, those will be informed, or those can be informed by which map you use, as long as it's identified. If you go into the development of this map, and again, this is outlined in those rules in 8 CCR 1507-39. You can find those on the website. You can also find them linked in the PDF that we have for this PowerPoint on our running notes. When you're developing those local maps, you need to incorporate certain items, but it can expand beyond that. So you want to look at vegetative fuel types. You want to look at historic wildfire occurrence, topography and slope, local weather patterns, and then fire behavior modeling or risk assessments. So take a look at those. You can incorporate those into the locally developed map. You can incorporate other things that you think may be necessary. All of these local maps need to be verified for compliance by the board. So again, found in those rules, 8 CCR 1507-39, you will, once the map is developed, submit that to the Wildfire Resiliency Code Board. The maps that meet or exceed the map that's been developed for the state, those will be just verified for compliance. Now, if a local map changes or decreases the identified fire intensity classification in areas within their jurisdiction, that will need to be approved by the code board. We're going to work with everyone, so if you can send us the information that informs the development of that map to the committees, they'll be taking all of that into consideration when they're looking at the approval. So again, follow those rules that are outlined. Look at section 303 in the code. And once you've done that and you submit it to the petitions committee with our subject matter experts, we'll look at the review of that and take all of your information into consideration when they're making those decisions about approval. So that's the local mapping. Now, just as a reminder, we've adopted the state code. You have 9 months to adopt a local code. With the adoption of your local code, you can also develop a local map or choose to use the state developed map for that code application. So those are really the full background and overview of the code itself and what we've been working on. If you guys have any questions or if you're looking for specific resources, you can always go to our website. There's a QR code here. This is also linked, so you can find our website right there. I did drop it into the chat. And again, if you have any questions, you can contact the code board at that email address right down at the bottom. So that is our full presentation for today's webinar. I'm going to pass this back to Marguerite to walk us through our next steps.
Thank you, Carrie. And I'm going to just stop recording now so we can have a more open